July 18th, 1940. The air inside the War Department's office in Washington, D.C. was thick with cigarette smoke and urgency. Telephones rang in sharp bursts, typewriters hammered like machine guns, and a group of exhausted officers stood around a table cluttered with blueprints, coffee cups, and half-crumpled memos. A colonel tapped the paper with the back of his pencil. "We need a light reconnaissance vehicle," he said flatly. "4-wheel drive, quarter-ton payload, strong enough to pull a field gun, light enough to be dropped from a transport." The man beside him, a young procurement officer named James O'Connor, flipped through a stack of proposals. Most were over budget. Overweight, overcomplicated. The war in Europe was escalating, and Britain's desperate cables painted a bleak picture. The U.S. wasn't in the war yet, but everyone in that room could feel it breathing down their necks. O'Connor sighed. "Nobody can build it in time," he muttered. "They're asking for prototypes in 49 days. 49 days. That's when a small company from Butler, Pennsylvania, the Bantam Car Company, raised its hand. A handful of engineers, no major factory, barely any money. But they had something the others didn't. Desperation. And they knew a man who could make the impossible happen. His name was Karl Probst. July 22nd, 1940. In a cramped Detroit workshop, Probst leaned over a blank drafting board. He was 55, gray at the temples, the kind of engineer who preferred results to conversation. On his desk sat a telegram from Bantam's president, Frank Fenn. "We're going to lose this contract unless we can get plans to Washington. Will you help?" Probst read it twice, then reached for his slide rule. He'd heard of the Army's absurd specifications: 600 pounds lighter than any car on the road, able to climb a 40% grade, seat 3 soldiers, and a machine gun. Every engineer he knew said it couldn't be done. Probst simply said, "We'll see." By midnight, he was sketching the skeleton of what would become the most recognizable vehicle of the 20th century. The pencil lines came fast: a boxy chassis, flat fenders, fold-down windshield. Every line had a purpose. Simple, functional, interchangeable. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. But it worked. By day 2, he had the drivetrain drawn. By day 4, a complete set of blueprints. 5 days after he started, he rolled up the final draft and handed it to Bantam's courier. "Tell them," he said, "it'll run." The courier left for Washington that night. And with that, one man's week-long sprint had just altered the course of the entire war. When the blueprints reached the Army Ordnance Department, officers pored over them in silence. Every piece, every bolt, axle, and bracket was simple enough to be mass-produced by any factory in America. The design looked almost crude, like a child's drawing compared to Ford's polished sedans. But something about it made sense. The men around the table exchanged glances. "This," one said, tapping the paper, "could actually work." September 23rd, 1940. As dawn broke over Butler, Pennsylvania, mechanics at the Bantam factory tightened the last bolts on the prototype. Oil-stained hands wiped sweat from their foreheads. There were no fancy machines, no assembly line, just a handful of men, a dirt floor, and a looming deadline. They had 49 days to build what others said would take 6 months. When they rolled the finished vehicle out of the workshop, it looked like something between a toy and a tank. Squat, rugged, purposeful. The word Jeep hadn't been coined yet, but the soul of it, that stubborn simplicity, was already alive in the frame. A test driver named Harold Christ climbed in, adjusted his goggles, and hit the starter. The little engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. Men cheered. Someone slapped the hood. "She's ugly," Christ shouted over the noise, "but she'll go anywhere." And soon enough, she would. The next morning, the Bantam reconnaissance car, the original prototype of the Jeep, was loaded onto a flatbed and driven straight to Camp Holabird, Maryland, the Army's proving ground, the real test. If it failed, Bantam would go bankrupt. If it succeeded, America would gain its first true war machine on wheels. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The convoy pulled into Holabird under a blazing September sun. Soldiers gathered around, skeptical. The vehicle was small, almost comical next to the Army's hulking trucks. A lieutenant chuckled. "That thing's supposed to carry a gun crew?" Christ just grinned, pulled the handbrake, and said, "Watch this." He floored it. The little machine tore across the mud track, leaping ditches, climbing hills, skidding through pools of water, and never once got stuck. By the time it screeched to a halt, covered in mud but still purring, every officer on the field had the same look on his face. Shock. The impossible had just been done. September 24th, 1940. Camp Holabird, Maryland. The Army's test drivers had seen everything. Broken axles, blown transmissions, machines that rattled apart before finishing a mile. But this little Bantam? It refused to quit. By the third lap of the obstacle course, soldiers were climbing onto sandbags and fuel drums just to get a better look. Mud sprayed. Tires clawed through the ruts. The 45-horsepower engine whined like a furious wasp. But it climbed slopes meant for trucks twice its size. An officer leaned to his colleague. "You realize what this means?" The other man smirked. "If it holds together another day, it means we've just found the Army's legs." They were right. For 2 days straight, the Bantam reconnaissance car, as it was officially called, tore through the Army's proving ground without failure. It forded streams, hauled sandbags, climbed 40-degree inclines, and even pulled a light artillery piece. The soldiers testing it gave it a nickname almost immediately: the Blitz Buggy. They laughed as they bounced around in it. But there was awe in the laughter. Because this wasn't a machine you sat in. It was one you wore, like a uniform. It became clear that Bantam's creation had done something extraordinary. It had turned engineering efficiency into military poetry. Still, the Army had its doubts. Bantam was too small. They could barely produce 75 vehicles a month. The coming war, everyone knew, would demand hundreds of thousands. So while Probst's design aced the field trials, procurement officers began whispering names like Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company, companies with real factories, production lines, logistics. By October, the War Department quietly requested that Bantam's blueprints be shared with the other bidders. Officially, it was for evaluation. Unofficially, it was the beginning of a quiet betrayal. Karl Probst didn't complain. He wasn't naive. He'd built the machine to help win a war, not to win glory. But when he saw Willys engineers walking into Holabird holding his own drawings, he muttered, "At least they're copying something that works." November 1940, Toledo, Ohio. The Willys Overland Company was in trouble. Their finances were bleeding, and their management was desperate to prove relevance. When the Army handed them the Bantam plans, Willys engineers immediately began tweaking the design. Their lead engineer, Delmar "Barney" Roos, stared at the Bantam specs and frowned. "It's good," he said, "but it can be better." He replaced the engine with Willys' own, the 60-horsepower Go Devil. Stronger torque, better climbing power. They widened the body by 2 inches, gave it a stouter suspension, and reinforced the frame. It wasn't as light as the Army wanted, but it was tougher. Then came Ford. The industrial giant built their own version, nearly identical to Bantam's. They called it the GP, short for General Purpose. Soldiers, mishearing the name in conversation, started calling it the Jeep. And just like that, a legend found its name. Winter 1940, back at Camp Holabird. All three models, Bantam, Willys, and Ford, lined up for comparison. It was like watching three siblings of the same bloodline. Same silhouette, same flat fenders, same grin-shaped grille. Test drivers switched between them for weeks. Each machine had its charm. Bantam's was nimble. Ford's was well built. But Willys had power. When the Army tallied the results, the decision was unanimous. In July 1941, the contract for mass production went to Willys Overland. The Willys MB would become the standard light utility vehicle for the U.S. Army. Bantam received a consolation contract to build trailers. The engineers in Butler were furious, but Probst only smiled faintly. If the goal was to make something that wins wars, he said, then maybe we already did. By 1942, production lines thundered across America. Willys factories ran 24 hours a day, sparks flying, wrenches clanging, workers tightening bolts in rhythm with swing music on the factory radio. Each Jeep used 150 feet of steel, 600 bolts, and 75 pounds of paint. It could be disassembled in the field and reassembled by hand in under an hour. Its parts were interchangeable. A Ford axle could fit a Willys body, a Bantam wheel could mount to either. This wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a philosophy of war. Simple, flexible, relentless. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, the little four-wheeler became a moving symbol of Allied mobility. The soldiers had a saying, "If it can't do it, it can't be done." In March 1942, a Jeep rolled off the Willys assembly line with a white star on its hood and was immediately shipped overseas. It would become the first of more than 640,000 to follow. At that moment, no one could have known that the machine born from one man's 5-day design sprint would end up changing how wars and industries were fought. But history was already shifting under its wheels. June 1942, Alamein, Egypt. The desert sun bled white over endless dunes. British and American mechanics crouched beside a line of dust-caked jeeps, their shirts soaked through, their mouths dry. The air shimmered with heat and the hum of distant aircraft. A sergeant kicked the tire of one Willys MB and muttered, "She's running hotter than hell, but she still runs." The Jeep's engine coughed once, then roared awake, like it always did. It didn't complain, didn't stall, didn't hesitate. The machine seemed to share the soldiers' stubbornness. That day, under the merciless African sun, the Jeep proved it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a companion, one that bled, sweated, and fought alongside them. Across the desert, General Montgomery's staff nicknamed it the Mosquito. It darted everywhere, between supply lines, over dunes, through wadis. Commanders used it as a rolling command post. Medics used it as an ambulance. Infantrymen strapped machine guns to it and turned it into a mobile fortress. To the Germans, it became an irritant, a symbol of Allied persistence. You couldn't bomb it, couldn't stop it. It always came back, covered in dust, headlights cracked, still alive. A war correspondent once wrote, "It looks like a toy, sounds like a cough, and fights like a tank." Half a world away, in the jungles of Burma, Merrill's marauders were cutting their way through vines and enemy fire. They moved light. No tanks, no trucks, just mules and jeeps. Private Sam Weller, 307th Composite Unit, wrote in his diary, "If you haven't sat on the hood of a jeep crossing a bamboo bridge at midnight, you don't know what faith is." Sometimes the vehicles had to be taken apart piece by piece and reassembled across rivers. Sometimes they were dragged up mountains with ropes and pulleys. But every time, when the final bolt was tightened, the engine would cough back to life like a promise kept. 1943, Sicily. American paratroopers landed scattered and lost after the night drop. Radio contact was patchy, roads were rubble. Yet by dawn, small columns of jeeps began to appear, each carrying supplies, wounded men, and officers trying to make sense of the chaos. In one photo, now buried in archives, a jeep is parked in front of a ruined church, its grille reflecting morning light. Beside it, a chaplain gives last rites to a wounded private. The vehicle's hood serves as an altar. The caption reads only, "Faith, steel, and rubber." As the war spread, so did the jeep's legend. It wasn't elegant like a Spitfire or fearsome like a Sherman, but it was everywhere. And that ubiquity was power. It carried generals, Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, through bombed-out cities. It ferried resistance fighters through the French countryside. It delivered mail, ammo, and sometimes hope. Eisenhower himself would later call it one of the 3 decisive weapons of the war, alongside the C-47 transport and the landing craft. The Jeep had earned a place not just in logistics, but in the mythology of victory. December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow buried the roads, tanks froze in place, fuel lines snapped in the cold. The Battle of the Bulge had turned Belgium into a white tomb. But through the blizzards, the small, boxy silhouettes still moved. Jeeps, headlights dimmed, engines sputtering in the cold, carrying medics, messengers, and food. Private Leon Carter of the 101st Airborne remembered it years later. When everything else quit, the trucks, the guns, even some of the men, the Jeep didn't. You'd see one crawling up a frozen hill, 2 guys pushing from behind, and you'd think, damn, that little thing's got a soul. By 1945, the Jeep had driven across every climate, every front, every heartbreak. In the Pacific, Marines lashed stretchers to the sides for wounded men. In Europe, liberated civilians rode them through the streets, waving flags and flowers. In Italy, a Jeep carried General Mark Clark into Rome. In France, another carried Charles de Gaulle down the Champs-Élysées. In Germany, a Jeep rolled through the gates of Dachau, the camera following its tires as they crushed the gravel of liberation. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It had become a witness. When the war ended, tens of thousands of Jeeps were left scattered across the world. Some were shipped home, others gifted to allied nations. Farmers turned them into tractors. Explorers used them to map jungles. In France and the Philippines, they became taxis. A machine built for war had, somehow, become an instrument of peace. Back home in America, Willys seized the moment. They printed ads showing soldiers driving Jeeps through rivers and mud, with one line that said everything. "It's the Jeep, the one that won the war." But behind every ad, every parade, every gleaming civilian version rolling off the line, there was still the shadow of a man with a drafting board in Detroit. Karl Probst, the engineer who'd done it all in 5 days. And though his name never appeared on the contracts, his fingerprints were on every bolt. Spring 1945, Detroit, Michigan. The factories that had once thundered with the music of war were falling silent. The assembly lines still gleamed with oil and steel, but the urgency was gone. Workers paused between shifts, their faces older now, their hands scarred by 5 years of non-stop production. In one corner office of the American Bantam car company, Karl Probst sat by the window, a cup of cold coffee beside him, watching the rain beat against the glass. Newspapers on his desk shouted the end of the war. Victory in Europe. Japan surrenders. Peace at last. And yet, for Probst, there was no victory parade. Bantam was bankrupt. The Army had chosen Willys and Ford to mass-produce the vehicle he had designed. The company that birthed the idea had been reduced to building trailers, thousands of little steel boxes that would never bear the fame of the Jeep itself. Still, Probst didn't curse the irony. He had been around too long to expect fairness from history. What mattered to him was that it worked, that it had saved lives, that it had carried men home. In those first months after the war, journalists came calling. They wanted to meet the man who designed the Jeep. Some described him as gruff, others as polite but distant. One reporter from the Detroit News recalled asking him, "Mr. Probst, how does it feel to have created the most famous vehicle in the world?" He smiled faintly. "I didn't create a legend," he said. "I just drew what the soldiers needed." Then he turned back to his drafting board, still covered in half-finished blueprints for projects that would never see daylight. That was Karl Probst, practical, reserved, almost invisible. Yet invisible men, history often finds, shape the most visible empires. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Jeep was becoming something more than a machine. In the ruined streets of Warsaw, children played in the shells of abandoned ones. In Paris, artists painted them as symbols of liberation. In the Philippines, locals rebuilt stripped-down versions and named them jeepneys, turning war relics into vehicles of color and livelihood. Everywhere it went, the Jeep adapted, just like the soldiers who'd driven it. In the deserts, it became a workhorse. In the cities, a courier. In the countryside, a reminder that freedom could move on 4 wheels. It was as if the spirit of the war's endurance, that stubborn American practicality, had found its home inside that small, square frame. 1946, Toledo, Ohio. Willys engineers were already drafting the CJ series civilian Jeep. They kept the same shape, the same steel bones, even the same grille. Only the purpose changed, from reconnaissance to rebuilding. Farmers bought them to haul tools. Ranchers used them to mend fences. Adventurers took them to places no car had ever gone. The Willys CJ 2A, painted in fresh peacetime colors, rolled off the line with quiet pride. But even as the company celebrated, the engineers knew. The soul of this machine was older than any factory label. It belonged to every mechanic who had turned a wrench in the dark, every soldier who had driven through the rain, every engineer who believed simplicity was sacred. And above all, it belonged to the man who'd drawn it in 5 sleepless days in July 1940. Years later, in 1948, the U.S. government finally awarded Karl Probst a small commendation for his work on the Bantam design. No medal, no check, just a certificate of appreciation. He accepted it quietly, framed it, and hung it in his home office. To visitors, he'd gesture at it once, smile, and change the subject. To him, the real reward had already been seen. In black and white photographs of soldiers leaning on jeeps in Italy, in letters from veterans who swore those little machines saved their lives, in the simple fact that his idea had endured longer than war itself. By the time Probst passed away in 1963, the world had changed. The Jeep had evolved from military mule to symbol of adventure, freedom, and resilience. It was climbing mountains in Colorado, crossing jungles in Africa, parked in driveways from Ohio to Okinawa. Magazines called it the car that could go anywhere. But to those who remembered, it was still what it had always been, a friend forged in mud and steel. And as the 20th century marched on, the image of the Jeep, headlights like eyes, grille like a grin, became something sacred in the collective memory of a generation that had fought and bled and rebuilt. It was no longer just a tool of war. It was a testament to human endurance, to the belief that sometimes the simplest ideas carry the greatest weight. If you closed your eyes and listened carefully to the echoes of that era, the rattle of steel on the assembly line, the hum of engines rolling off the docks, the laughter of soldiers hitching rides through liberated towns, you could almost hear it still. The heartbeat of a nation on four wheels. The hum of a Jeep.